Have you ever heard of a Bigfoot who broke every law of his kind just to protect his child? In the remote forests of western Montana, where the Yaak River runs beneath ancient pine canopies, locals still whisper about Ardan, a towering creature with amber eyes who once climbed a 200-foot cliff to save his baby from the talons of a mountain eagle. Contrary to Bigfoot tradition, where males never raise their young, Ardan made an impossible choice. After losing his mate, he cradled his fragile newborn and faced fire, hunger, and steel traps, just to keep him alive. Witnesses say it was a deer, grieving her own lost fawn, who first fed the baby. And watching from the shadows that rainy night was Margaret Hale, a 62-year-old widow who'd lost a child of her own. This isn't a fairy tale. It's a forgotten chapter, pieced together from footprints in the snow, old rescue logs, and one woman's journal. If you stay with this story, you'll discover what drove Ardan to leap from a deadly cliff with his child in his arms, why a wild deer chose to nurse a Bigfoot baby, and how two lonely souls, one human, one legend, learned to trust across the bounds of fear and species. 1 year later, after a silent winter, Margaret found a familiar piece of cloth folded neatly on her porch, cleaned and returned. No one saw Ardan again, but in the Yaak Valley they say the wind still carries his breath through the trees. So, where are you watching from? How far can a story like this reach? From one heart to another. Wherever you are, thank you for being here. We send you our warmest greetings from the forests of Montana to your screen. At the rim of Hawk's Notch, the morning sky was a slate-colored hush, still wet with mist and the memory of night. Pine needles trembled in the windless dawn, and the world held its breath as if it too was waiting for something to break the silence. A single cry echoed through the valley, not from the ground below, but from above, sharp and cold as flint, the scream of a mountain eagle. Then it dropped. Out of the pale sky, it fell like a blade, slicing the air as its shadow glided over stone. Its wings opened wide, massive, dark, unearthly. And before the light had a chance to gather strength, the eagle struck. Claws curled, a gasp of wind. A small, brown-furred figure was torn from the edge of the cliff with a soundless jolt, limbs kicking in the sky. Ray didn't have time to cry out. One moment he was crouched beside the edge, chasing his reflection in a puddle. The next, he was high in the air, the sun flashing across the curve of a talon streaked with blood, his body hanging limp in the grip of something older than the forest itself. From below the cliff, a growl broke loose. Not just a growl, a thunder. Ardan came charging from beneath the overhang of stone, his massive frame smashing through moss and mist and broken rock. His head snapped upward, his amber eyes caught the shadow above, and without a second thought, he leapt. No plan, no calculation, no fear. His feet tore from the earth, and the weight of his body, near 1,000 pounds of bone, sinew, and soaked fur, flew out over the void like a falling star no one asked for. The wind howled around him. The sun blinked behind clouds. In that suspended second, the mountain held its breath again. Far below, down where the cliff wall gave way to a narrow band of pebbles and riverweed, the water waited. Still, black, cold. Margaret Hale had lived 62 winters in that valley, some harder than others. She had buried a husband and a son. She had learned not to ask for miracles. That morning, like all mornings, she rose before the light and stepped out onto the porch of her cabin, tea still steaming in her cup, wool shawl pulled tight across her shoulders. Her cabin stood quiet on the north bend of the Yaak River, the boards creaking in familiar rhythms, the roof dripping from last night's fog. The air was heavy with pine, the soil soft beneath the frost. She didn't see the eagle. She didn't hear the leap. But she heard the splash. Loud, sudden, too heavy to be anything human. The sound echoed off the far bank and shuddered across the surface of the lake like a ghost trying to rise. Her eyes snapped to the shoreline, and the cup slipped from her hand, shattering on the steps. At the water's edge, rings spread outward like breath on glass. Nothing moved, no voice followed. Only silence again, too thick to be natural. Margaret stepped down into her boots and crossed the clearing without knowing why. The grass was wet. Her knees ached. Something old in her stirred. She reached the gravel shore and looked down where the ring still trembled. Nothing, no body, no feathers, just water and rock and cold wind. And then, there it was, a single strand of fur, long, dark, still slick with blood. It lay tangled between two stones, and the second her fingers brushed it, her breath caught. Not from fear, not quite awe either, but something close to it. Something in her bones told her this didn't belong to anything in her books or in the stories whispered at town halls. Something not meant for hands like hers. The fur was coarse, but beneath the dried blood, there was a warmth to it. A scent that made her think of rain and ash and ancient places. She held it, trembling. Not because she didn't understand, but because some part of her did. And that part whispered, "You were meant to see this." The silence didn't lift. It grew heavier, pressing in like snow clouds before a storm. Behind her, the forest waited. The river flowed as it always had. But in that breathless gap between scream and splash, between the eagle's wings and the shivering pine, something had shifted. Ardan had disappeared beneath the water with no sound but the rupture. No one saw him fall. No one saw what followed. But the mountain remembered. The mist remembered. The ripple across the lake carried more than water. It carried weight, blood, will, and the heart of a father. Ray had never known the world above the cliffs. He had only known the damp walls of their hidden cave, the smell of moss and the sound of his father's footsteps. But in that instant, in the grip of talons and fear, he saw it all. The sky, the void, the blur of trees far below. He felt the wind suck the breath from his chest, felt the burn of cold through his fur, and somewhere beneath the panic, he felt something else, the tremor of his father's voice, not spoken, but known. A presence reaching after him, a promise flung into the open air. And then there was only light. Not sunlight, but something whiter, sharper, the light of fear. The eagle circled higher, its wings slicing the haze, dragging Ray through currents no baby should ever feel. Its cry tore through the valley again, claiming its prize. But it hadn't counted on the father, on the storm that rose from stone and root and sorrow. Far above the trees, Ardan caught hold of something. He didn't know what. A root, a ledge, maybe memory. He hung, his breath ragged, his fingers bleeding, and pulled himself up inch by inch. But that would come later. First, the fall. In that single moment, in the arc of body against sky, there was no time, just instinct, just love. The mountain didn't care. It had seen creatures fall before. It had seen blood. But it had never seen this. A father throwing his life into the wind, not to escape, but to save. Margaret would not forget the sound of that splash. Not in a week, not in 10 years. It would stay with her, not like a horror, but like a hymn. The kind of sound that rewrites something in you, that tells you the world is not always as cruel as it seems, that sometimes something fights back, not with fire, not with fury, but with the full weight of devotion. She stood at the shore long after the ripples vanished, clutching the fur in her hand, her eyes scanning the horizon for any movement. None came, only mist. The sun never fully rose that morning, just hovered behind the clouds like it, too, was unsure if it should shine. Back on the cliff, feathers drifted. A single talon, smeared with blood, clutched nothing but air. The eagle vanished beyond the ridge, its hunger unsated. The forest exhaled. The wind picked up. Somewhere far below, something moved beneath the water. And so it begins, not with a scream or a storm, but with a silence broken by a father's leap in a stranger's heart, awakened by something she didn't yet understand. And though no one saw what really happened that morning, though no voice cried out to say this was the start of something sacred, the mountain knew. And the river knew. And Margaret Hale, standing with wet boots and a trembling hand, knew in the smallest place in her chest that she had just witnessed the impossible. She didn't speak. There was no one to speak to. But in the hush of that Montana dawn, where old things hide and even older things remember, something new had been set in motion, something the world would not forget. Not this time. 3 months before that morning when the eagle tore through the sky and carried the world out from under Ardan's feet, the valley still wore winter like a half-forgotten coat. Snow clung in shadows, melting slow against the black soil, and everything seemed wet. The moss, the bark, the bones of the trees. Spring had come, but only just, and it came not with flowers, but with dripping silence, the kind that stretches for miles through timberline and fog. The rivers ran swollen and cold. Even the sun, when it rose, seemed tired. And in the hush between seasons, tucked inside a hollow carved by wind and time, Ardan kept his family hidden from the world. The cave sat high above a gully, covered by lichen and a slanted shelf of stone. Nothing about it looked like home from the outside, but inside, where the light didn't reach, it was warm with breath and heartbeat. Sava slept near the back wall, her shape curled in on itself, her fur dark and damp with the weight of late pregnancy. She had grown quieter these last few days. Her chest rose and fell with a rhythm slower than sleep, and sometimes her hands moved as if she were holding something not yet born. Ardan never left her side for long. He moved like shadow just outside the mouth of the cave, foraging, guarding, watching. Each morning, he followed the ridgeline until the wind shifted, then backtracked in wide circles, his ears tuned not to birdsong or elk or squirrel, but to the sound of absence, the break in pattern that meant man had come. His kind didn't trust fire or the stink of gasoline, but traps were harder. Traps didn't smell like danger. They smelled like iron and rain, and by the time you tasted that in the air, it was already too late. That morning, it was Sava who stepped beyond the mouth of the cave first. She was slow, but not weak. She moved with the care of something ancient, the kind of slowness that knew how to survive. Her belly sagged low, her breaths shallow. She wanted water, not moss or dew, but flowing stream water, clean and moving, the kind she used to find before she grew heavy with life. Ardan had tried to lead her to safer spots, but she shook her head and touched his wrist with hers, the way she did when she wanted to decide. He hesitated, then let her go, trailing close behind. The stream was not far, but even 10 yards in those woods can become dangerous when the world has learned how to hide its teeth. The ground was slick with thaw. Underfoot, roots curled like veins, and somewhere under a pile of wet leaves and mud, steel waited. Sava didn't cry out at first. She just sank. Her knee buckled, and then there was a sound. A snap, not of bone, but of instinct, breaking. The metal jaws had clamped just above her ankle. Her fingers clawed at the ground, and then the pain reached her throat. She screamed, not the way humans do, not with words or reason, but with something older, something raw. It tore through the trees like a fire ripping through dry bark. Ardan heard it, and the moment he did, he was already running. By the time he reached her, the air was red with scent. She was on her side, thrashing weakly, her breath stuttering. The trap was buried deep, teeth sunk past fur into flesh, blood pooling fast beneath her. He fell to his knees beside her and roared. But there was no enemy to tear apart, no predator to fight, just that cruel, inanimate thing, dug into the earth like a secret. He tried to pry it loose. His hand slipped. Sava's eyes locked onto his, wide and afraid, but not of the pain, afraid for him, for the child. Then her body convulsed. The birth came too fast, too soon. There was no time to clean, to cradle, just instinct. The small one slid out onto the moss, shivering and quiet. At first, there was no sound. Ardan stared at it, stunned, unsure if it was even alive. Then it moved. A breath. A soft cry, barely more than a whimper. His hand reached out, trembling, brushing fur slick with birth and blood. Sava's head turned slowly. She saw the baby. Saw it wriggle weakly beside her. Her hand lifted, hovering over the tiny chest, then dropped. Her body shuddered once, twice, then went still. Ardan didn't make a sound. Not at first. He sat beside her, one arm around her shoulders, the other around the infant, holding both as if he could keep time from moving. His breath came heavy, slow. The cave around them was too quiet. Outside, the world dripped on. The trap glinted beneath the soft light. He didn't even try to remove it. When night came, he carried Sava's body up to the highest stone he could find. It was an old place, a flat slab covered in moss and ringed with wild ferns, not far from a stand of trembling aspens. He laid her there gently, curling her hands over her chest, brushing hair back from her brow the way he'd seen her do in sleep. Then he covered her, first with long grass, then with armfuls of pine needles and soft branches. Over that, he laid down sheets of bark, packed with mud to keep the wind from pulling her apart. And finally, he took the cedar leaves, dry and fragrant, and placed them at her feet, like a quiet offering. He stayed there long after the moon had risen. The baby, Ray, slept curled against his chest, wrapped in the warmth of his fur and the steady beat of his heart. Ardan didn't cry. His kind didn't weep the way humans do. But something in him folded in that night, a deep silent ache that settled into his bones and would not leave. He lowered his head until it touched hers and stayed that way until dawn. When he returned to the cave, it was colder. The fire pit had gone out. He didn't light it. He just sat in the dark, holding the infant. Ray made no sound, just breathed, soft and steady, as if even in his newness, he understood something had been lost. In the days that followed, Ardan did not move far. He left only when he had to find water, to scrape mushrooms from the undergrowth, to gather anything that would not sour Ray's belly. The child wouldn't feed, not from berries or chewed bark or roots. His cries grew weaker. His skin, still thin beneath the fur, hung looser across his ribs. Ardan tried to hum the way Sava used to. It only made the baby cry harder. On the third night, a storm rolled in from the north. Rain fell in sheets, hammering the rocks outside the cave. Ardan paced. He rocked the child in his arms, then set him down and tried to hunt, but the scent trails were drowned. The world smelled only of wet bark and thunder. He knelt at the cave's edge, staring into the dark. The wind howled. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called. Ray whimpered behind him. He turned back. The child was curled tight, breathing shallow, too shallow. And then, not a sound, but a shift, a feeling. Ardan's head rose, his ears twitched. Something had moved near the stream. He slung the infant across his shoulder, wrapped tight in leaves and moss, and crept through the dark. The rain soaked them both. Trees bent with the weight of it. But he moved quickly, low to the ground, breath caught in his throat. At the water's edge, a small herd of deer stood, drinking, shadows in the mist. He knew these woods well enough to recognize them by shape. Among them, a mother, young, delicate, stood slightly apart, her flank still streaked with old milk. No fawn beside her. She had lost it. That was clear. Ray whimpered, a tiny sound, but enough. The doe lifted her head, her ears flicked. She saw him. Her eyes locked on Ardan's, then dropped to the small bundle he held. The wind carried the infant's scent. She stepped forward. Ardan knelt. He didn't move closer. He made himself small, turned his gaze to the side. His posture softened, not submission, not fear. Something else. Something like grief. The deer stepped again. The others didn't follow. They watched, frozen. And then, against every law of nature, against every instinct etched into her bones, she leaned down. Ray reached up with both hands, mouth opening, instinct taking over, and she let him. For a few minutes, time held its breath once more. The rain fell around them, soft and steady. But in that clearing, something sacred passed between species. Ardan watched with wide eyes, stunned, humbled, trembling with something too old to name. And far beyond the trees, where an old woman named Margaret Hale had wandered with a rusted tin pail in hand, drawn by the thirst of her own quiet heart, she paused at the sight through the trees. She didn't raise her gun, didn't step closer. She just watched, and in the blur of deer and beast and child, she saw something that didn't belong to this world anymore. Something that reminded her of a time long ago, when she had held a child in smoke and cried out for mercy. And none came. Now mercy had arrived, in silence, in rain, in a moment that would live only in memory. She let it live. She turned and walked away, and behind her, the child drank, and the forest, for once, did not interfere. The rain didn't stop for days after Sava's death. It soaked the trees, peeled bark from trunks, turned trails to mud, and wrapped the whole valley in a gray that felt like mourning. The world seemed to move slower, as if waiting for someone to catch up. Inside the cave, Ardan sat with Ray pressed against his chest, both of them damp and silent, their breath fogging in the cold air. The fire pit remained dark. The stone walls seeped moisture. Every sound outside the cave felt too far or too sharp. Branches cracking under the weight of water, distant cries that weren't familiar, the groan of the earth shifting under snowmelt. Ray stirred sometimes, trying to cry, but it came out dry, rasping. His body was small, too small, his movements twitchy and uncoordinated. The kind of weak that makes you hold your breath and count the seconds between each rise and fall of the chest. Ardan tried to feed him from what the woods would allow. He brought back roots and softened bark, mushrooms he knew weren't bitter. He mashed berries between his fingers and pressed the pulp to the child's lips, but Ray wouldn't take it. Or couldn't. Ardan didn't know which. He only knew the cries were getting quieter. And when Ray slept, his limbs twitched like he was falling even in his dreams. Ardan's hands, the same ones that could rip bark from trees and lift stones heavier than men, were helpless, too large, too clumsy, too late. At night, Ardan would lie down curled around Ray, forming a barrier between the infant and the cave's mouth. But even in the darkness, he couldn't close his eyes. His mind kept tracing back to Sava's last breath. The way her eyes had stayed open, but empty. The way her hand had tried to reach for the baby, but never made it. Sometimes he thought he heard her voice in the wind. Other times, it was just the ache echoing back at him. He had no rituals for mourning, no language to name it. His kind didn't bury with words. But still, something in him grieved like a man. And in that silence, fatherhood grew not out of duty, but from the void her death had left behind. The third night without food came cold and clear. The clouds lifted just enough for the stars to show through. Ardan held Ray in his arms and stepped out of the cave, the moonlight silvering his fur, his breath steaming in the air. He stood for a long time staring out toward the river bend, listening. The forest was asleep, but not peaceful. There were eyes watching, unseen but present. Coyotes, maybe, or something hungrier. Ardan turned and followed the slope down into the trees. Ray whimpered once. Ardan answered with a low hum. Not a song, just vibration. A sound to say, "I'm here." They moved slow. Ray was bundled in fur and moss, a small warmth against Ardan's chest. The dew clung to everything. Underfoot, ferns unfurled in the dark, brushing against his legs. By the time he reached the stream, dawn was just beginning to color the sky. Not pink, not gold, just a pale light breaking through the fog. That's when he saw them. Across the stream, not more than 20 feet away, stood a small herd of deer. Does mostly. Young ones with narrow shoulders and nervous feet. One of them, slightly larger, lighter in color, stood still. She didn't drink. She didn't bolt. Her ears twitched once, then again. She turned her head slowly toward Ardan, and in that frozen second, the forest held its breath again. Ardan crouched low, not hidden, not threatening. He moved deliberately, lowering himself to one knee, keeping Ray close to his body but not covered. The baby stirred again, whimpered. The sound was soft, hoarse, like air pushing through cracked leaves. The doe's ears flicked. She took one cautious step forward. Ardan tilted his head, turned his body slightly sideways, exposing his shoulder, the curve of his spine. Submission, not weakness. He didn't look at her directly, just held still. Ray whimpered again, louder this time, a gasping sound, and something in the deer broke. She stepped closer. A second, then a third. Her legs trembled, but she didn't stop. She crossed the stream in slow, deliberate strides, the water parting around her knees. When she reached the edge of the bank, she hesitated. Ardan didn't breathe. The doe leaned forward, nose twitching, sniffing at the air between them. Her eyes found Ray. The bundle moved slightly, letting out a broken cry. The sound reached her in a place deeper than instinct. She lowered her head. Ardan didn't move. He watched, silent. His heart thudded so hard he could feel it in his throat. The deer nudged closer. Ray's hand reached out, small fingers barely formed, grasping at the air. And then, impossibly, she let him close. She stepped forward and stood still. Ardan shifted carefully, guiding Ray's mouth to the underside of her belly, where her milk still waited for a fawn that would never come. Ray latched, and the forest exhaled. It didn't last long. A few minutes, maybe. But in that span of breath and stillness, something ancient passed between predator and prey. Not truce, not forgiveness. Something more sacred. Like the world agreeing to pause, just long enough for a miracle. When Ray finished, the deer stepped back. She didn't run, just turned and walked away, her hooves light on the moss, her shape vanishing into fog like a thought slipping out of reach. Ardan stayed kneeling. He didn't cry, but something inside him cracked and softened. Behind them, in the trees, Margaret Hale stood still as stone. She had come for water, a battered tin pail in her hand. The same one she'd used for years, dented and rusted at the edges. She hadn't expected to see anything that morning. She rarely did. Her life had shrunk small these days, porch to river, river to garden, garden to quiet evenings alone with old radio shows playing faintly in the background. But she'd woken early, restless. Something had pulled at her. And so she walked, and when she saw it, the towering figure, the child, the deer, she didn't scream, didn't run. She lowered the pail to the ground and stood watching, hands trembling, lips parted. The scene in front of her made no sense, and yet every fiber of her knew it was real. Not a hallucination, not a dream. Something the world no longer allowed, but had once known how to honor. The way the large one moved, slow, respectful, reverent. The way the deer had answered not with fear, but with a kind of maternal ache. It pressed hard into the hollow space behind her ribs. the one she'd tried to bury beneath old recipes and flannel shirts and Sunday crossword puzzles. The space where the memory of a child still lived. A boy with sunburned cheeks and ash on his fingers. A boy she couldn't save. The tears came slow. She didn't wipe them away. She didn't move until long after the deer had gone. When she did, she backed away without a sound. And behind her, Ardan rose to his full height, tucking Ray back into the wrap of his chest, and vanished into the trees. The sun broke through the clouds not long after, just enough to scatter light through the canopy and paint the wet leaves gold. But neither Ardan nor the child saw it. They were already back in the cave, curled together in the dark, the baby finally quiet, his belly full. That night the forest was still. The owls didn't call. The coyotes kept their distance. And inside the cave, for the first time since Sava died, Ardan closed his eyes. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like a hush, as if the whole valley had seen what happened that morning and agreed to carry the secret forward. The summer came in dry and sudden, like a door swinging open to a room full of dust. By mid-July, the soft rains that had clung to the valley for months vanished, leaving behind a brittle silence. The creek beds thinned. The moss browned at the edges. The ferns curled in on themselves like fists. And even the wind, once cool with snowmelt, now blew sharp and restless, scraping across the valley like it was trying to uncover something buried. Fire season had arrived early, and the trees felt it in their bones. That morning, the lightning came first. No thunder, no rain, just white streaks tearing down from a cloudless sky. They danced along the ridges and vanished into the hills. One bolt struck a dead pine near the river bend, splitting it down the center like a matchstick, sending sparks into the dry grass below. The flames started slow, crawling along the dirt like they weren't sure they were allowed to grow. But the wind gave them permission. By the time Margaret Hale smelled the smoke, the fire had already moved. She stood on her porch with a cup of coffee cooling in her hand, eyes narrowed toward the tree line. The air tasted different, metallic. She set the cup down and reached for the canvas water bucket hanging from a nail by the door. She didn't need to ask questions. You live long enough in these woods, you'll learn how to read a fire's handwriting before it speaks too loud. Tate Rourke was already at the back fence with a shovel and a look that didn't match his age. 15 going on 50, eyes too serious for someone who hadn't yet grown into his own shoulders. His family lived just up the ridge, but since his folks left for Idaho 2 weeks ago, Margaret had been feeding him biscuits and giving him chores he pretended to resent. He didn't say much, but he showed up every morning with his sleeves rolled and boots muddy. She didn't ask more than that. Didn't need to. She tossed him the extra bucket. "River's dropped," she said. "Might need to go further downstream." He nodded, already moving. They passed through the thinning edge of the forest, where dry grass licked at their ankles and the trees seemed to lean away from the smoke. A thin column of gray lifted in the distance, curling above the treetops like a question no one wanted to answer. By the time they reached the slope above the river, the fire was visible, a low, crawling line of flame, no taller than a man's boot, chewing through underbrush and fallen pine. It hadn't yet crossed to their side, but the wind shifted fast and the ground was hot beneath their soles. "Circle left," Margaret called. "Keep your eye on the bluff." Tate broke off toward the bend, and she moved down slope, fast for her age, the bucket sloshing against her leg. She dipped it into the shallows and ran back up, tossing water onto the dry edge nearest the old cottonwood that had survived more lightning strikes than any tree had a right to. And just across the fire line, where the smoke began to thin, something moved, broad, dark, and fast. It was Ardan. He wasn't running the way a man would run from fire. He was charging straight through it, his arms wrapped tight around Ray, the child's head tucked under his jaw. His fur was streaked with soot, his breath loud. His eyes were wide, darting, desperate. He wasn't running for safety. He was running for survival. They were too close to the heart of the blaze. Margaret felt the heat before she saw the danger. A rusted metal trap, its shape half buried in scorched grass, sat in the exact path Ardan was headed. The fire hadn't touched it yet, but the jaws were open, teeth glinting in the orange light like it had been waiting for this moment. Margaret dropped the bucket. She didn't shout. She didn't wave. She sprinted. There was an old wool blanket tied to her waist, soaked through from the river. She yanked it free and flung it hard across the grass, the weight of it thudding against the trap just as Ardan closed the distance. She dove forward, using her foot to pin it down, grinding it into the dirt until the metal teeth vanished under the mud and ash. Ardan didn't break stride. His foot landed inches from where the trap waited, pressed harmless beneath the blanket. He passed her in a blur of heat and motion, a low rumble in his chest, eyes flicking toward her just once, just long enough to see, just long enough to know. And then he was gone, disappearing into the smoke. Margaret turned in time to see Tate stumble back from a patch of burning scrub. His pant leg was smoldering, and behind him, a tree crackled as flames crawled up its trunk. She ran to him, yanked the blanket free, and slapped it across his leg. He dropped to the dirt, coughing, eyes wide. "I'm good," he rasped, but she could see his hands shaking. "You're a terrible liar," she said, pulling him up. "Back to the cabin, now." They didn't speak much on the way back. The fire hadn't grown big, not yet, but the smell clung to everything. The kind of smoke that seeps into your skin, into your memory. By the time they reached the yard, Margaret's hands were black with soot, and Tate's cheeks were streaked with ash, and tears he hadn't meant to let fall. They stood on the porch, watching the smoke rise in the distance, both of them breathing hard. And far behind them, deep in the brush, Ardan paused. He crouched low in a thicket, holding Ray close, the boy's breath warm against his collarbone. Ray had fallen asleep during the run, his tiny body limp with trust. Ardan's muscles ached, his legs burned, but he didn't move. He looked back toward the place where the fire had tried to claim them. He could still see the shimmer of heat in the air, still smell the trap, the iron stink of it, old and cruel. And he remembered the woman's face, blurred through smoke and flame, not afraid, not hostile, just aware. Their eyes had met for a second. That's all. But in that second, something passed between them. Not recognition, but understanding. Ardan stayed hidden until the fire died down. He moved again only when the stars began to show, when the air turned cold and the crickets dared to sing again. He didn't return to the cave that night. He found shelter in a shallow ridge above the river, half covered in vine and stone, where the boy could sleep without smoke in his lungs. And down in the cabin, Margaret sat at her kitchen table, fingers wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee gone cold. She stared at the old blanket folded over the chair, still smelling of smoke, still heavy with ash. She'd seen things before in these woods, prints too large to name, shadows that moved like myths. But this was different. This had weight. This had eyes. And something in her, something she hadn't listened to in years, told her this wasn't over. Not yet. Not by a long shot. Autumn didn't arrive with a whisper that year. It came on the back of a northern wind that tore the breath out of the valley and sent the first maple leaves spinning through the cold air like rust-colored coins. The rains had finally returned, but they brought no warmth. They slid down bark and soaked the roots, filled hollows and lifted the smell of moss and soil into the sky. The trees turned slowly, a week at a time, reds and golds bleeding through the ridges like fire waiting to happen. And in the quiet fold of the valley, beneath a ledge of stone warmed by the pale slant of afternoon sun, Ray played. He was bigger now, stronger. His legs had found balance. His lungs knew how to carry sound. He'd begun to hum to himself, little warbles and throat clicks that echoed faintly off the stone. He ran in circles around the boulder Ardan had cleared for him weeks ago, slipping on wet leaves, laughing in his own small way when he stumbled. His fur had darkened since summer, thickening against the wind. He still looked strange in daylight, part dream, part something older. But his joy, raw and small and real, made the cold air feel warmer. Ardan sat nearby, silent as ever, watching. His body, still massive and solid, had taken on a leaner look since the dry season. His fur held the reddish tint of fallen pine needles, and a new scar curved over his left shoulder, a long pale streak where fire had once grazed him. But none of it showed in his posture. He sat like the stone behind him, unmoving, eyes sharp but soft when they settled on Ray. He had become a watcher more than a mover, a guide more than a guardian. And yet, even now, even as Ray tumbled through the dappled clearing with leaves tangled in his fur and breath fogging in the chill, Ardan's ears twitched at every crackle of twig, every shift of wind. His instincts had never quieted. They just sank deeper, waited longer. That morning had been peaceful. But peace in this valley never stayed long. It began with a sudden silence of birds. 1 second, the forest breathed as it always did. Crows in the distance, squirrels chattering, the far-off tap of a woodpecker. And then, as if someone had placed a hand across the mouth of the world, it stopped. Ardan was on his feet before his own breath caught up. Ray had noticed nothing. He stood, curious, tilting his head toward a patch of sun, but Ardan moved fast, one stride, then another, and swept Ray into his arms just as the shadow passed overhead. The sky darkened, not with clouds, but with wings. A mountain eagle, larger than any he'd seen that year. Its wingspan stretched near 10 feet, feathers outlined in silver from the sun's low angle. It didn't call, didn't scream. It simply dove, silent and sure, its claws open and ready. The force of its descent kicked up a cloud of brittle leaves. Ardan dropped, twisting his body so his back would take the blow. But the eagle missed by inches, banking hard and spiraling back up. Its yellow eyes locked on the bundle in his arms. It had seen the small one, and it wanted him. Ardan didn't wait. He ran, through the trees, across the slippery carpet of pine and oak, one hand shielding Ray's head, the other pushing off trunks as he turned. The eagle came again, faster, this time clipping a branch so close behind them that bark exploded into the air. Ardan grunted, leapt over a log, and landed in a crouch. His shoulder flared with the old scar's heat. Ray whimpered, small and confused. Ardan looked up. The eagle was climbing again, circling, lining up. And above them, beyond the ridge, stood the stone crest of Hawk's Notch. Bare, open, a natural platform the wind never left alone. If the eagle pushed them there, they'd be exposed. But it didn't matter anymore. The bird was faster. Ardan broke into a sprint. He dodged fallen trunks, clawed his way through brush, leapt a creek that had thinned to half its size since spring. His lungs burned, his legs screamed. But the eagle was already coming, and in the cabin by the river, Margaret Hale looked up from her stitching, her hands freezing mid-movement. She heard it before she saw it. The wind shift, the scream of something primal, and that impossible sound she'd come to recognize in dreams but never say out loud in daylight. She stood. She didn't know why. Then she walked out into the cold. The eagle dove. This time it didn't miss. Its claws scraped Ardan's back as he ducked again, and one talon caught Ray's side, slicing through fur, pulling the child halfway out of Ardan's grasp. Ardan roared, a guttural sound that broke open the trees and twisted violently, tearing Ray back toward his chest. But the eagle turned in midair, flapped once, and with a final surge of speed, it struck. Ray vanished, carried into the sky, limp and bleeding. Ardan stopped, dead center of the clearing, his arms empty, his hands outstretched, shaking. He didn't roar this time. He chased, across the field, up the slope, toward the bare stone line of Hawk's Notch. He didn't think, didn't blink. He just ran, and somewhere, From a mile and a half downriver, Margaret turned toward the noise, her heart thudding in her chest. She grabbed nothing, no jacket, no boots, just moved. Moved like the earth had shifted and she couldn't stand still. She didn't know what she'd find, but she stopped at the edge of her shed, her eyes locking onto something strange in the corner. A wooden board, long, flat, weather-worn. The old plank from the summer's flood, the one she'd used to bridge the creek for Tate's dog. She stared at it. Then she picked it up and walked toward the sound. On Hawk's Notch, the eagle banked once more, wings flashing gold in the sun. Ray dangled from its claws, twitching faintly. The drop below them was sheer. Rock to river, 200 feet down. Ardan reached the edge just as the eagle passed overhead. And without hesitation, without calculation, he leapt. The wind tore the sound from his throat. The world tilted. He didn't care. He was falling, but falling toward. The eagle screeched, startled, and Ray slipped. Ardan caught him mid-air, held him against his chest, curled his body like a shield. They plummeted. And far below, at the edge of the river, Margaret reached the shore just as the sun hit the lake. She looked out and saw only the rings of wind on water, and the last of the eagle's shadow vanished behind the ridge. She didn't know yet what had begun, only that something had been torn from the sky, and the world would not be the same. Not after this. The air at that height was thinner than it looked, sharp and dry, scraped clean by years of wind carving at the stone. Hawk's Notch had never been kind, not even to the birds that claimed it. The ledge sat like a cracked tooth against the sky, jutting out from the mountain's face, daring anything that climbed to look down. And now, halfway up its vertical face, a shadow moved where no shadow belonged. Ardan was climbing, not like an animal, not like a man. Like something caught between the two, desperate, driven, bleeding, climbing, not with strength but with something buried deeper. Every movement came with a risk of death. Every reach left him more exposed, but still he climbed because he'd seen where the eagle had gone. And he knew what was waiting at the top. Blood already streaked his hands, thick around the knuckles, slipping into the fur on his wrists. One of his claws had snapped back trying to grip a mossy edge. His shoulder burned from the earlier strike, but he didn't slow. He didn't hesitate. He found cracks where there were none, dug into crevices where only wind and lichen had lived before. And above him, in the shadow of a twisted pine that had no right growing that high, the eagle's nest waited, silent and sprawling, built of bones and branches and rags of things no one should have left behind. Ray was there, somewhere inside that mess of sticks and sinew. Ardan had heard the whimper. Just once. Thin and soft, almost swallowed by the wind. But enough. Enough to carry him one more step. Then another. Below him, the valley dropped like a mouth opening wide. The wind funneled up the cliffs and slapped hard against his spine. Pebbles broke loose under his feet and fell with no sound. His breath came ragged, open-mouthed, pulled through clenched teeth. Each time he reached higher, the moss peeled back, exposing slick stone underneath. He slipped, recovered, slipped again. His shin cracked hard against the rock, and a growl ripped through his chest, not from rage but to keep from collapsing. A crow screamed overhead, then another. They circled the ledge above like they knew what was coming. From across the ridge, Margaret watched through the battered brass scope of her old field binoculars, the kind her husband had once used for elk spotting. The glass was cracked on the right side, but still clear enough to see what shouldn't have been seen. Her hands were shaking, the scope resting against the windowsill of the upstairs loft. She didn't move, didn't blink, because what she saw defied everything she understood. The creature, not animal, not man, climbing sheer stone like it had been born for it. And a nest, the size of a man's bed, perched up near the notch, pulsing with shadow and movement. She couldn't make out the child, but she felt it. She knew it. Somewhere in her body, something that remembered loss and silence whispered, "He's up there." And still, the thing climbed. Ardan's shoulders screamed when he hauled himself past the last vertical run, his forearm gushing from a gash where the rock had bit back. He didn't stop. He didn't dare. The nest was right there now, just one last ledge, a flat shelf no wider than his own body, and then he'd reach it. But the final stretch was the cruelest. No handholds, only a slick curtain of granite, angled just enough to make hope look possible. He took one breath, then another, and then he jumped. His hands slapped the lip of the ledge, fingernails scraping stone, one slipping, then catching. He swung, clawed, shoved his knee up, forced his body into a half-crawl, half-drag until he was fully over. Then silence. He lay there for one heartbeat. Two. Wind howled past his ears. The clouds hung low enough to taste. Then he rose. The nest was larger up close, layered with matted grass, fur, feathers, twigs thick as antlers. And in the center, Ray, curled tight, shaking, a line of dried blood smeared down his side, his amber eyes wide, too wide, blinking at nothing, his chest fluttering like a bird that had forgotten how to breathe. Ardan stepped forward, slow, careful. That's when the eagle came. It dropped from behind the tree with no warning. Wings out, claws open, rage and instinct coiled into one. Ardan turned just in time to catch the strike with his forearm. Talons dug in. The weight knocked him back, nearly over the edge. His heel caught a root, and he fell hard onto his side, rolling just short of the drop. The eagle came again. He rolled toward Ray, shielding him, gripping a length of broken branch with his good hand. The eagle dove, struck his back, trying to find the soft spot under the shoulder blade. Ardan roared, swung the branch upward. It cracked across the eagle's wing. Feathers burst into the air like ash. The eagle shrieked and climbed again, circling. Ardan covered Ray with his body, curling over him like a shell. He didn't move, didn't breathe. He waited. The eagle dove once more. He turned at the last second, swung again. This time he caught the beak. Bone snapped. The bird spun off, flapping hard, disoriented, its cries wild and warbling. It didn't come back. Silence returned. Ray didn't cry. He just reached up and touched Ardan's chest, his tiny fingers curling into the fur there. His lips moved, but no sound came. Ardan lifted him, held him to his chest, and that's when his knees gave out. His vision pulsed. His shoulder had gone numb. Blood soaked his side, hot, then cold, then hot again. The wind pushed harder. The edge looked closer now. He blinked. Behind his eyes, the light turned softer. A memory flickered. Saba, not whole, not alive, but not a ghost either. Her eyes, not accusing, just watching. And in the blur of her gaze, he saw something. Not a message, a direction. The ridge just to the left, where a narrow channel of stone arched toward a lower outcrop, barely wide enough to step. But maybe, just maybe. He turned his body, holding Ray tight, and crawled. His foot slipped once. Pebbles rattled down, but he reached it. The channel was slick. Wind tore at his side. He pressed himself flat and moved inch by inch, never letting go of the child. One step, then another, until finally the wind shifted. Not stopped, just changed. And that's when the ledge beneath him crumbled. A crack tore through the stone, louder than anything else. And then they were falling. Not fast, not yet. Just the first drop. And below them, somewhere through the mist and pines, a board floated quietly on the water, waiting. The sun had already dropped behind the western ridge, but its final light hadn't yet let go of the sky. Everything was tinted blood orange. The tips of the pine trees burned gold, and the river far below looked like molten glass rolling through the valley. It should have been beautiful. It should have felt safe. But the air at the cliff's edge carried no peace. It only carried sound. Wind howling low through the stone canyons, the far-off call of an eagle growing nearer, the rasp of a father's breath who had nothing left to give but still hadn't stopped giving. Ardan stood at the brink of the cliff, one foot on broken stone, the other pressed into a patch of moss that had no business surviving there. His body swayed in the wind, arms locked around Ray's limp frame. His chest rose and fell in shallow bursts. Blood soaked through the fur of his back and sides. A dozen wounds screamed, but he didn't feel them. His world had shrunk to the child in his arms. Ray's tiny hand twitched once, then went still again. His eyes were closed. His breathing was shallow, but he was alive. Behind them, the ledge they'd just escaped crumbled a little more. A rock the size of a man's skull broke loose and tumbled, knocking smaller stones free as it disappeared into the gorge. Ardan didn't flinch. He just turned his face toward the wind and looked down. The river shimmered far below, cold, black in places, flashing gold in others, and drifting near the bend where the cliffs met the water. A piece of wood, flat, wide, faded to gray, floating with just enough resistance to catch the current sideways. It moved slow, like it didn't want to be noticed. But Ardan saw it. Somehow, across all that height, he saw it. And in the sky behind him, the eagle returned. Its scream split the silence, sharp and final. It had circled once already, wounded and furious, blood along one wing, a limp in its left talon. But it wasn't done. This was not hunger anymore. This was territory. This was war. Ardan turned, shifted his body so Ray was pressed against his chest, one massive hand cradling the back of the boy's head. The eagle dove. He didn't wait. Didn't give it another chance to knock them off balance. He bent his knees. He took a breath, and he jumped. The wind caught him like a hammer to the chest. His body folded around Ray, legs tucked, arms locked. The cliff face fell away behind them. The world tilted, blurred. He couldn't hear anything but the roar of air, couldn't see anything but the smear of sky and stone rushing past. The fall was faster than thought, faster than fear. There was no time for memory, no time for prayer, just the impact waiting. The river rose, the board moved, and in that final moment before the world broke open, Ardan twisted mid-air, positioning his back toward the water, curling tighter, pushing Ray as close to his heart as he could. His body hit first, not the water, the board. The crack echoed across the valley. Wood split. Water exploded in white spray. Ardan's body slammed down hard, the board absorbing the brunt, but snapping under the weight. Pieces of it scattered, and the rest vanished into the depths. Then silence, then bubbles, then nothing. For 3 long seconds the river held them. Then Ardan surfaced, not with a gasp. He didn't have breath for that. He clawed up from the water with one arm, the other wrapped still around Ray. His eyes were bloodshot, one swollen shut. He dragged his body toward the reeds along the shore, kicked against the current, every motion slow and heavy. His legs barely moved. His mouth hung open, but no sound came. He reached the gravel edge and collapsed halfway onto the bank, his chest rising once, then falling. He didn't move again, but Ray did. A cough, weak but sharp. Then another. His small fingers twitched against Ardan's chest, and he blinked against the blur of a light. And not far away, behind a stand of alder trees, 2 figures crouched low in the brush. Margaret was frozen in place. Her hand clutched Tate's arm, holding him still. They had followed the sound, not expecting to see anything. They'd only meant to leave something. Berries in a folded cloth, a gesture. But then they heard the cry overhead. Then the splash. Now she stared through the leaves, breath caught behind her ribs, tears spilling without sound. The thing on the shore wasn't a monster. It never had been. It was a father, dying, a boy in his arms, living. Tate looked at her, his eyes wide, face pale, lips parted like he wanted to speak. But she shook her head, eyes still locked on the scene ahead. They didn't step closer. They didn't call out. Instead, Margaret reached slowly into her satchel and pulled out the soft cloth, white with a faded blue hem, something her sister had stitched for her during her husband's final hospital stay. Inside were wild huckleberries, picked just before sunrise, and a square of dried bread. Nothing much, but it was what she had. She placed it gently at the edge of the clearing, a few feet from where the reeds began. Then they backed away. The sun was gone now. The river had turned silver. Frogs began to croak. Crickets chirped in the shadows. The wind settled into something softer, and under the bruised light of early night, Ardan's chest rose again, just once. But it was enough. The boy slept. The father breathed. And somewhere behind the trees, Margaret Hale wept. Not from fear, not even from grief, but from something deeper. Something like awe. Something like knowing she had just witnessed the end of one life and the beginning of something that did not have a name yet, but was sacred all the same. She did not know if the father would live through the night. She did not know what would happen come morning. But she knew one thing. They had survived the fall. And somewhere inside her, some place that had been still too long, a warmth returned. A flicker. A thread. Not hope, but something just as stubborn. Something just as bright. The snow had come early that year, soft and silent, draping the Yaak Valley in white before Thanksgiving ever showed its breath. It didn't announce itself. It didn't swirl. It just fell, straight and steady, as if the sky had finally grown tired and needed to rest. Everything quieted. The river thickened with slush. The deer moved lower, their steps almost weightless on the powder. Margaret Hale's porch creaked under the weight of the storm's first full coat, and the world outside her cabin took on the hush of a place holding its breath. It had been nearly a year since that night by the river. Since she'd left the cloth and berries in the reeds. Since she watched the impossible rise from the water with a boy in his arms and vanish again into the shadows. She hadn't spoken of it to anyone. Not even to Tate, who'd moved away in the summer to attend a small trade school in Boise. They still wrote letters, but she never said a word about the night he cried in the trees, or the shape they saw rise from the riverbank. She didn't need to. Some things you carry quietly, like bones wrapped in silk. That morning, her hands trembled more than usual. It had been getting worse. The cold didn't help. Her joints swelled, and her fingers, once so quick with a needle, struggled even to tie the twine around the cinnamon bundle she'd meant to leave by the firewood pile. She set it down and walked to the sink, rinsing the thin layer of ash from the tea kettle, then stared out the window for longer than she meant to. Something was different. She couldn't say what. The light, maybe. Or the way the snow lay across the river trail, untouched but waiting. She stepped onto the porch, wrapped in her oldest flannel coat, and breathed in the morning. No birds, no truck sounds, just the hush and the steam from her breath curling into the gray sky. She hadn't planned to walk far, just to the old dock by the bend where the logs sometimes stacked after the thaw. But her boots took her further. She followed the same trail she used to walk with her husband when they were young, when the valley still felt wide and wild and full of years they hadn't yet spent. She passed the thorn bush where he once tore his jacket trying to chase off a raccoon, the hollow tree that Tate used to hide candy wrappers in, thinking no one knew, the small bend in the trail where the grass never grew, not in spring, not ever. And finally, she reached the place where she'd seen the cloth folded and returned. It was gone now. Of course it was. But something else had taken its place. Tracks. Not boots, not hooves. Tracks too wide for any man. 5 clear toes, deep set into the snow, each print as long as her forearm. They trailed along the river's edge, pausing where the bank dipped, then rising again to the ridge where the rocks flattened out. The snow hadn't yet filled them in. They were fresh, and they led to the place where she'd once laid a gift wrapped in cotton and silence. She stood there, heart thick in her chest. Not from fear, but from a kind of knowing that pressed behind her ribs like music you haven't heard in years. Her knees trembled. She lowered herself onto the stump beside the river and stared at the snow-packed ground, following the line of prints to a single spot just beside the sycamore. There, the snow had been brushed aside, not randomly, delicately, like someone had swept it clear with an open hand, like someone had paused, knelt, and stayed long enough to see the ice melt beneath the warmth of their body. And right in the center, a square of cotton, washed clean, folded, tied with a sprig of cedar. Margaret's hands reached for it before her mind caught up. She touched the cloth like it might vanish if she moved too fast. Her throat closed. She sat there for a long time, the snow falling in soft spirals, blinking against tears that didn't sting anymore. They were alive. Somewhere, still. By the time the sky turned silver, she'd made her way back to the cabin. Her steps slower, but her shoulders lighter. She made herself tea, poured 2 cups out of habit, one for her. One left on the table across from her, steam curling like smoke from a signal fire. She didn't speak aloud, but she didn't need to. That evening, just before dusk, she walked to the back field, past the clothesline, past the old chicken wire she never got around to taking down, to the tiny grave behind the barn, no name carved into the stone. Just a smooth river rock she'd placed there herself, years ago, with the weight of a name she never dared say. A child she'd tried to save once. A life that ended in flame and smoke and memory. But this time something had changed. The snow around the grave had been cleared, every inch of it, swept in a perfect oval. No footprints leading to or from it. Just the snow pushed back, as if someone had sat there, as if someone had taken their time, as if someone had known. She knelt, pressed her fingers to the dry earth beneath. It was still warm. She didn't cry this time. She just nodded, because something had come full circle. Something sacred had passed through. Something that did not speak with words, but with gesture, with silence, with the kind of grace that lives only between those who understand loss in the same language. And across the valley, behind the veil of fir trees, Ray stood, taller now, his fur thicker, darkened with age. His body still small for his kind, but stronger than winter. He stood just out of view, where the wind tugged at the branches and the shadows stretched long. He watched the woman, the one who'd fed them, saved them, waited for them. His amber eyes shone beneath the moonlight, blinking slow, unafraid. He didn't move forward, didn't need to. She knew. And in the hush of snow and sky, as night finally fell in full, Ray turned and walked back into the trees. Not alone, not anymore. And as he vanished into the woods, the wind shifted once more, curling around the cabin like a whisper left behind. Soft, wordless, full of thanks. Margaret listened to it, her eyes still on the grave, her breath visible in the moonlight. And then, as if to close a chapter only the trees could read, she whispered back, "I remember." And the snow kept falling. Sometimes, the deepest truths are found in silence. We live in a world full of noise. Voices competing to be heard. Answers shouted before questions are even asked. Judgments made before understanding begins. But in the stillness of the forest, under the hush of snow, beside rivers that remember everything, something quieter speaks, something older than words. It speaks of love not shown through grand gestures, but through presence, through protection, through staying, through returning. This story is not just about survival. It's about what it means to truly care for something that cannot speak for itself. It's about the courage it takes to hold on when everything tells you to let go. About the kind of love that crosses boundaries, not just of species or language, but of fear, of grief, of time itself. Because there is a kind of humanity that has nothing to do with being human. It's found in the way we protect the fragile, the way we mourn what's lost, and the way we offer kindness even when no one is watching. Sometimes the greatest acts of grace are done in the dark, unnoticed, uncelebrated. But they ripple out, quiet and wide, shaping the world in ways we may never see. And maybe that's enough. Maybe we don't need to understand everything. Maybe wonder is a kind of wisdom. Maybe believing in the goodness of things we can't explain is what keeps us from becoming numb in a world that so often forgets how to feel. We were not made to conquer every mystery. Some were given to us so we'd remember how to be gentle. This story asks us to look again, not with the eyes of fear or doubt, but with eyes softened by compassion, to notice what moves in the margins, to listen when the world gets quiet, to understand that even the most unlikely bond can be the beginning of healing. And above all, it reminds us that love, real, selfless, enduring love, leaves a mark even when it walks away without a sound. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If this story moved you, if it stirred something you thought had gone quiet, we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Your reflections mean more than you know. Don't forget to like, follow, or subscribe if you'd like to walk with us on more stories like this. Tales that live not just in the shadows of imagination, but in the quiet truths of the heart. Until next time, may you find something sacred in the silence.